Hello and welcome. My name's Ben Hales with Transform My Poker, and today I'm covering off one of those topics that I don't know. It's a question that's thrown at me. It seems like it's been thrown at me since the dawn of time, since the beginning of poker. How to beat passive games. I know there are tons of you out there playing in home games, in live games, in low stakes online games where the games are really passive and you're still struggling to conquer this dynamic. So today we're going to go through some really simple steps on how you can crush these games. All right. So first of all, what makes a passive game a passive game? How do you recognize that type of game? Well, you're going to see lots of people before the flop limping in, and then lots of people calling bets, whether they're calling just by limping with other people or calling raises. These are passive actions. So aggressive actions are bets and raises, and passive actions are limps and calls. So when you see a lot of pre-flop limps and calls, this should be your signal. I'm in a passive game. This table is playing passively. One of the other things that's going to categorize your game as passive is when you're not seeing many people 3-betting and 4-betting. So there's lots of limps, but there's not even much ISO raising, not really a whole lot of raising going on, and definitely not much 3-betting or 4-betting. If you're seeing lots of those things, then your game is more normal or perhaps quite aggressive. And then the other thing to look for is if there's lots of loose calling post-flop. So you see somebody calling something down and what are they doing? They've only got bottom pair, or what are they doing? They've missed a draw. Why are they just continuing to call and call and call? These are calling station type opponents, and they frequent passive tables. Okay, so how do we beat these tables? Well, the adjustments we should make are as follows. Number one on your list, and by far the most important thing to remember, is that you need to bet for value. When you have a good hand, bet strong. Don't be afraid of big sizes. In fact, I actively encourage you to choose suboptimal large sizes because it's an adjustment you're making. It might not be correct poker to bet 6 times the big blind, but if they're gonna call anyway with worse hands, it's a good adjustment, right? It's pretty simple, but this is an adjustment that people just don't seem to make, and this is maybe one of the things you can do to improve the way you're playing in these games. So not only are you betting when you've got a strong hand, but you're betting a large size, and you're also prepared to do it sometimes when you don't think your opponent should be calling with that many weaker hands, but because you know your opponent is a loose calling station, then he's probably going to call with bottom pair or worse. You can sometimes go value betting with hands even weaker than top pair or middle pair on the river, okay? So when you're considering value betting, don't just think about what you would call with in his spot. Think about what that player's likely to call with, because his range is going to be wider and full of more junk than your range. Now, the other thing that you should try and do is to isolate passive players pre-flop. So if you know you've got a poor opponent at the table who's limped into the pot, maybe a couple of people have limped, try where possible to raise in position. So if you're on the button, cut off in particular, get a raise in. You can choose quite a wide range of hands and try and make sure you're betting enough to get down to one opponent. So isolate. The third thing is to limp, and this might seem like a strange adjustment, but honestly, if there's lots of people limping into a pot, your pot odds for getting in and seeing a cheap flop become very attractive. And when it suits you to do so, particularly with suited, connected hands, situations where you've got amazing pot odds to just see a flop, go ahead. You know you can just fold cheaply post flop most of the time. You're not worrying about that. It's such a good investment to see a flop, because when you do flop two pair or stronger, you know you're going to get paid off by these guys. So see cheap flops with poor opponents. Really good advice. Okay. Fourth thing, don't bluff. And I'm not saying don't ever bluff, because there may be situations, even on a passive table, where bluffing is the right strategy. But you need to be very confident that bluffing is going to work. Most of the time in these games, your opponents are calling too much. So why bluff into them? You don't need to bluff in these games. One of the biggest mistakes that people make is bluffing, making what would be perhaps really good poker plays and throwing their hands up in disgust when somebody calls. But you shouldn't be making the bluff against these opponents. And on a similar note, don't go hero calling, because passive players don't usually bluff. When they bet, they usually have the goods. So post flop, if you see an opponent check raise and then go all in, you know, there's no point trying to call him down with a top pair hand, which you think, oh, well, maybe he's bluffing. He's probably not bluffing. So you can fold quite happily most of the time when your opponent shows aggression. All right, so there are your 5 big pointers from this. A few more things. When you're deep stacked in tournament spots, just follow the same advice. There's not really an awful lot that's different if you're in a tournament. And if you're deep stacked, it plays out much like a cash game situation. But when the game goes shorter, then you don't want to deviate too much from what is optimal. Play a normal push-fold game when you're down to 10, 12, 15 big blinds, right? Because remember, these guys are going to fold too much pre-flop, and they're going to call too much pre-flop. They're making both types of mistakes. So it would be a mistake for you to suddenly get too tight, because they are going to fold. Because they pre-flop behavior from passive players doesn't mean that they're just calling every all in. They're actually got a fairly good idea of what hands to call with pre-flop, because even weak poker players understand that concept. So what you're going to find is that often you can make them fold too much, and that means you should be playing an aggressive strategy if you're in a push fold situation. So this is another mistake I see from players when they go short stacked in tournaments. They know they're up against passive players, and they clam up and they don't go shoving when they should, because they think, oh, I'm going to stay tight against these types of players, forgetting that calling stations tend to do quite a lot of folding pre-flop. So get busy and keep shoving. Okay. Next up, opponents could be tight passive or loose passive. And I think this is just an important point to observe. Most of the time, you're going to see loose passive players on these tables, so players playing lots of hands. But sometimes you will also come across passive tables, passive games, where your opponents are playing tighter ranges. So just be very conscious of the ranges that your opponents are playing, because that's going to have a big influence on your strategy. So for every opponent you're up against, think about, how many hands does this guy tend to play? If you are steal more from the tight opponents than you would from loose opponents. Against loose opponents, I'm not going to deviate my strategy too much. In fact, I'm going to rein back and play a tighter range. But against a tighter player, I'm going to tend to loosen up and try and peck away at him with lots of stealing and lots of small ball poker, trying to just make small bets to take it down post flop as well. But don't go too crazy. Don't throw lots of chips into the pot against tight players, because they're going to wake up with strong hands and they're not going to go away very easily. Okay, let's have a quick word about multi-way pots. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but remember, you are going to end up in multi-way pots. Don't go out of your way to avoid this. You can try ISO raising pre-flop like we talked about, but other than that, look, just realize you're going to get in them. Be patient. There's no point going crazy and getting impatient and throwing too many chips in with poor hands. Wait till you get something strong and then value bet, right? Don't do bluffing in multi-way pots. Don't try and be creative. Keep it simple. And that's the right strategy to beat passive games, all right? Next point. Bad beats. Yeah, this is important, because I think that when you go into a game that's really passive, full of calling stations, one of the things you need to keep in mind about calling station opponents is that these guys are going to suck out. They're going for it so many times with the worst hand. They're drawing with bad hands. They're inevitably going to occasionally suck out. Don't let it throw you when it happens. And if it happens twice, don't let it make you tilt. Keep on track. Keep playing the right style of poker. So remember, passive players are going to get bad beats in their favor. It is inevitable. Stick to your game plan and avoid tilting. Great advice. Now, the next slide is just a reminder not to forget the power of position. It's particularly important when you're exploiting weak opponents. They will limp and call out of position a lot. Take advantage of it. Don't be afraid of seeing flops with these guys when you've got position. Hopefully you're on the button or the cutoff, but as long as you've got position, that's the key to playing against these players. You're not going to lose massive pots very often if you have position, and you're going to find the post-flop action much, much easier. My final point is going right back to the most important thing you need to do to adjust on these games. Value bet. Value bet, value bet, value bet. And this is absolutely the key to beating these games. Remember, your opponents are calling too much, they're calling too often, they're calling too many chips, right? So what do? Very simple. You value bet often and you keep your sizings large. So if you can do all of that, I promise you, you're going to crush these passive games. My name's Ben Hales with Transform My Poker. If you enjoyed today's video, please do the Facebook like things down below and add your comments and questions. I'll be very happy to hear from you. Bye for now.